ready to go deep on Britain's Industrial Revolution.
Let's do it.
Okay, so it's a huge topic, right?
Yeah, for sure.
We're talking about how Britain went from like farms and fields to factories and machines, and it changed pretty much everything. The economy, society, how people live their lives.
It's a total upheaval, yeah.
So we've got a ton of sources to dig into for this deep dive. Articles, historical accounts, economic analyses, the whole works.
Wow, that's great. We need it, too. This is complex stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And to give you a taste of just how dramatic these changes were, one of our sources mentions that kids, like 5-year-old children, were working in factories.
5 years old.
Yeah.
Crazy, right?
That's unbelievable.
We'll get to all that later, but it kind of sets the scene. But before we jump into the factories and the grime and everything,
Right.
let's rewind a bit. Picture pre-industrial Britain. Rolling hills, farms everywhere, people living off the land.
Sounds so peaceful, you know.
I know, right? But our sources show that change was already brewing. Oh, really?
Yeah, they talk about new farming technologies like the Rotherham plow and
The Rotherham plow.
yeah, the winnowing machine. These things made farming way more efficient.
So fewer people needed to work the farms.
Exactly. And guess what? The population was growing at the same time.
Ah, I see. So you've got more people and less need for farm workers.
Yeah.
That's a recipe for change right there.
It is. And not only that, Britain had a lot of resources, especially coal.
Essential for the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. Fuel for all those new industries. It's like everything was lined up perfectly for this massive transformation.
And then, boom, enter the machines.
Right. The steam engine, the spinning jenny, the power loom. Production just explodes. Things get cheaper, more stuff available.
It's hard to even imagine the impact,
I know, right? One source compares the telegraph to getting a message across the country in minutes, not weeks. Mind-blowing, right?
Yeah.
But hold on. Because for the people working in those new factories, life wasn't all sunshine and roses.
No, I imagine not.
Our sources are pretty blunt about it. Long hours, dangerous conditions, tiny paychecks.
It makes sense, though. All those technological advances, someone had to pay the price.
Yeah, and it wasn't the factory owners, that's for sure.
Right. They were raking it in while the workers struggled.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that progress doesn't always benefit everyone equally.
Definitely. And that inequality, well, it led to some major social tension.
How so?
Well, you've got this huge gap between the haves and have-nots, right? The factory owners are getting richer, the workers are stuck in poverty.
I see.
And that leads to, well, to new ideas like class consciousness. Workers start realizing they're all in the same boat, and that leads to
To what?
the first labor movements. They start organizing, demanding better conditions.
Fascinating. It's a pattern we see over and over again, isn't it? Big technological changes, questions about who benefits.
Absolutely. It's happening right now, too, with AI and all that.
For sure. But let's stick with the Industrial Revolution for now. We've got those factories pumping out goods. And where are all those workers coming from?
The countryside.
Right. Cities just exploded in size, and they weren't ready for it.
I can imagine what happened.
Overcrowding, pollution, sanitation problems, crime, the whole 9 yards.
So it wasn't all, fancy inventions and progress.
Not for everyone, no. And those changes affected everything. Families, even what people could afford to buy.
Really? What kind of things?
Our sources mentioned the growing middle class being able to afford comfortable amenities, like nicer furniture.
Wow, so even furniture is a sign of progress.
Yeah, it shows how lifestyles were changing, how consumer culture was starting to take hold.
Fascinating. And it wasn't just stuff, right? People's values were changing too, weren't they?
Absolutely. Shifting from a rural farming mindset to an urban industrial one.
That's huge. What about things like women's roles or child labor? Were those being debated?
Oh yeah, big time. But speaking of child labor, we can't just gloss over that.
No.
Absolutely not. We've got to talk about that 5-year-olds in factories thing.
We do. It's a dark side of the Industrial Revolution we can't ignore.
No, we can't. It reminds us that progress isn't always pretty.
Right. And it's a story we're going to unpack, but first, we need to zoom out a bit and see how Britain's influence was spreading across the globe.
Okay, let's do it. I'm ready to hear about that. This Industrial Revolution wasn't just happening in Britain,
Oh, right. It started spreading, didn't it?
Yeah, big time. It had, ripple effects all over the world.
But why? What caused that?
Well, think about it. All those factories in Britain, they needed stuff, raw materials,
Oh, I see. And they got that stuff from...
Their colonies. They had them all over the place.
So to keep the Industrial Revolution going, Britain needed to expand its empire.
Exactly. They needed cotton, rubber, tea, you name it, and they got it from their colonies.
Makes sense. But that brings up some tricky questions, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Colonialism, exploitation, the impact on the people in those colonies.
It's a reminder that this isn't just a story about inventions and progress. It's also a story about, well, about power and inequality.
Right. And it makes you think about, like, the stuff we use today, doesn't it?
Yeah, like where it comes from, how it's made. It all goes back to the Industrial Revolution in a way.
For sure. It's a global story. But for now, let's bring it back to Britain and focus on how different people experience this revolution.
Sounds good. So where do we start?
Well, we've got to talk about the workers, right? They were the backbone of the whole thing.
Right, the people actually running the machines and making the stuff.
Exactly. But our sources, they don't paint a pretty picture of their lives.
Not a lot of happy factory workers in the history books, huh?
Nope. It was rough. Long hours, dangerous conditions, low pay, the whole deal.
It's hard to even imagine working like that. What was it actually like, day to day?
Well, imagine doing the same task over and over again for like 12 hours a day.
Ugh, sounds mind-numbing.
It was. And dangerous too. Accidents were all the time.
Why was that? No safety rules or something?
Barely any. And even if there were, who was gonna enforce them?
True. The factory owners weren't exactly known for being, well, worker-friendly.
Right. They were all about profit. And if a worker complained, boom, fired.
Wow, so what could they do? Was there any way for them to fight back?
It was tough. But that's actually where the labor movement gets its start.
Oh, really?
Yeah, workers started realizing they had to stick together, organize.
So what did they do?
They formed unions, went on strike, demanded better conditions.
It's kind of inspiring. Even in such a tough situation, they found ways to resist.
Totally. It shows you the power of collective action.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the workers, but what about the other side of the coin? The factory owners.
Ah, the big winners, right.
Yeah, our sources talk about them making fortunes, building huge houses, living the high life.
Champagne and caviar while the workers are, eating scraps.
Pretty much. And this created a whole new class of elites, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Industrialists, entrepreneurs, they had money and power, and they used it.
To do what?
Influence politics, shape the country, all that. They were the new power players.
Fascinating. And somewhere in between those two extremes, you had the middle class emerging, right?
Exactly. Not as rich as the factory owners, but doing way better than the factory workers.
So who are these middle class folks?
Shopkeepers, teachers, doctors, clerks, that kind of thing. They benefited from the economic boom.
So they had more money to spend.
Yeah, and they wanted the good life. Nice furniture, fancy clothes.
Like those comfortable amenities our sources talk about.
Exactly. It's a sign of their rising status, their aspirations.
They were fueling the consumer culture that the Industrial Revolution was creating.
Right. And they also, they pushed for things like education, social mobility.
So they were shaping society, too, not just buying stuff.
Totally. It's like all these different groups were pushing and pulling, shaping each other.
That's super interesting. But we can't forget about the dark side of all this, the child labor.
Yeah, you're right. We can't just sweep that under the rug.
We've talked about it briefly, but we need to really dig into it.
Absolutely. Kids as young as 5, working in factories, mines, awful conditions.
It's just heartbreaking. Why was this happening? Why were people letting this happen?
Well, poverty was a huge factor, right? Families were desperate.
I see. So a child's wages could make the difference between, eating or not.
Exactly. But it wasn't just that. There was also this idea that kids were, well, cheaper and easier to control.
Oh, so it was seen as a good business decision, using child labor.
Yeah, sadly. And their small size, it actually made them useful for some jobs.
Like what?
Squeezing into tight spaces in mines or working with delicate machinery.
Ugh, that's just awful. And what about these kids' futures? What happened to them?
Well, for a lot of them, it wasn't good. They grew up with health problems, no education, stuck in low-paying jobs.
It's like the Industrial Revolution trapped them in a cycle of poverty.
In a way, yeah. It's a reminder that all this progress, it came at a real human cost.
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
But I guess there were also some positive changes happening, right? Like the labor movement.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a sign of hope. People fighting for a better world, a fairer world.
It makes you wonder, if we're still fighting those same battles today.
I think we are, in different ways. But that's a conversation for another time, maybe.
It's wild, right? We started with peaceful farms and ended up in these, smoky factories.
Yeah.
All in one deep dive.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing journey when you think about it.
From the countryside to the city, from handmade to machine-made. The Industrial Revolution really did, like, flip everything on its head.
For sure. And not always for the better, right?
Yeah, we saw those social problems, the inequality, the kids working in factories.
But it also laid the groundwork for so much of what we have today, you know?
Oh, yeah. I mean, think about it. Those concerns we hear about now, automation, the environment, the gap between the rich and the poor, it all goes back to the Industrial Revolution in a way.
It's like a crash course in the challenges and the promises of technology all wrapped up in one era.
And that's what makes this deep dive so relevant, right?
Absolutely. It's not just about history. It's about understanding how we got to where we are now.
Right. So next time you hear about, like, AI or gene editing or whatever the new tech is, think about what we learned from the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, ask those tough questions like who's benefiting from this? Who might be losing out? What are the long-term consequences?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because progress isn't always a straight line, right?
Nope. And the Industrial Revolution shows us that very clearly.
So we need to be aware, right? We can't
Yeah.
just, like, sit back and let technology shape our lives without, thinking about it
Totally. We have a responsibility to steer technology in the right direction.
toward a better future, a fairer future.
Exactly, one where everyone benefits, not just a lucky few.
And this deep dive, it's given us the tools to do that, hasn't it? We've seen the good, the bad, the unintended consequences.
It's all about learning from the past.
Right. And making sure we don't repeat those same mistakes.
So listeners, what do you think? What connections do you see between the Industrial Revolution and, well, the world we live in today?
What lessons can we take away from all this?
And if this deep dive has, piqued your interest, don't stop here.
There's so much more to explore. Books, documentaries, museums, all sorts of stuff.
It's an amazing period of history, and the more you learn about it, the more you understand, well, everything.
So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into those topics that really fascinate you.
Because who knows, maybe you'll uncover something that helps us build a better future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Britain's Industrial Revolution.